Going to read from God's Word, and this morning I want to read Psalm 114. Psalm 114, verses 1 through to 8, which is the whole of the chapter. When Israel came out of Egypt, the house of Jacob from the people of foreign tongue, Judah became God's sanctuary, Israel his dominion. The sea looked and fled. The Jordan turned back, the mountains skipped like rams, the hills like lambs. Why was it, O sea, that you fled? O Jordan, that you turned back? You mountains, that you skipped like rams, you hills like lambs. Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, who turned the rock into a pool, the hard rock into springs of water. Today and at least next week, and I don't know whether we'll go beyond that or not, I'm not sure yet. But for the next couple of weeks at least, I want to look at the subject of strangers in a foreign land. We cannot possibly have missed or indeed been touched by some of the incredible pictures that have been coming onto our screens in recent weeks in particular. Somehow or other, over the last couple of years or so, that there has been terrible fighting going on in Syria. We've watched bombings. We've watched footage of towns completely destroyed, just left as rubble, of people fleeing and going into refugee camps on the borders or just over the borders out of Syria. The only places they could go in order to survive. And our hearts were touched and moved, there is no doubt about that. But somehow there is a greater reality to it now. And I think there are several things that have brought that home to us. Number one, I think, is it's not just a case of saying, look at those poor people. Look at the conditions that they're in. It's now a case of saying, some of them are heading in our direction. You know, it's kind of that attitude, isn't it, of a little bit of, at least, you know, the kind of not in my backyard syndrome. NIMBY. It's all right somewhere else, but as soon as people start heading towards our direction, that triggers a whole range of emotions. I'm pleased to say that some of them are very positive. Some of them are not so positive. No doubt you have heard, as I have heard, people putting up their arguments for saying why we shouldn't be accepting more refugees into the UK. There aren't enough resources to go round. We're overcrowded already. What if terrorists slip in among them? And a whole range of other excuses and reasons why people say we shouldn't open our borders. Not to mention, of course, those who say, well, it should be a proportionate distribution. And therefore, we've already got a great number of people that we're looking after in this country already. Therefore, Germany should be taking a whole load more than we are. And we're kind of squabbling over how this distribution of needy people is going to take place. Then, of course, there are those who have a much more positive, welcoming attitude, who say, look, you know, we actually have to do something to get these people out of danger and to meet those needs, no matter how little it is that we're able to do. That what we can offer is far better than what they're coming from. Question I would ask, I suppose, and ask us to consider is, how do we as Christians respond if there is a real threat of, say, terrorists slipping through, and we've heard quite a lot in the last few days of that kind of thing being suggested. I suppose it's inevitable that some will see this as the opportunity, so we have to place faith in the screening that takes place to ensure that only those who are genuine refugees seeking asylum are the ones who actually get through. Difficult task, I admit. Very difficult. But then you see, we could look at anything in life, couldn't we? And say, what if a terrorist turns up? It was interesting, a few months ago with other church leaders, we were meeting with the leaders of Merton Police, and they were talking about the number of foiled terrorist attacks that have taken place or didn't take place, more to the point, in London. Surprisingly high number of attacks. And as the chief said, it's not a case of if, but when one succeeds. And then we are ready. If you throw enough mud at the wall, some will eventually stick. So we can't be living in fear. That's what terrorism is all about. We need to be looking more positively than that. So how do we as Christians look at this? It is true, isn't it, that we don't have endless resources. The streets of Britain are not paved with gold, as I heard one person explain it to me, who told me that in their country they have been told the streets of Britain are paved with gold. What they can't understand is why their relations who are here don't just pick it up off the streets and send it back to them. You know, it doesn't work like that. But we do have so much. We are very rich people indeed. And we need to have big and generous hearts too, to reach out to those who have nothing. And what little they had has been taken away from them. And I think that as Christians and as God's people, that we, above all people, should understand and have a heart for those who are dispossessed. You see, God's people have always been those who have struggled. They have always been people who have had to fight to stay put for their rights. We read Psalm 114, and here the psalmist writing obviously very much later after events took place. But they're looking back on Israel's history and what God did for his people. And they look back to a time when they were in slavery. They were indeed strangers in a foreign land. I realise that what we're looking at today is very different. It's not about bringing people into slavery, and I'm not suggesting that. Please don't misunderstand that parallel and analogy. That's not the point that I'm making. The point I'm making is that God's people were indeed strangers in a foreign land. At first, in fact, when they went into Egypt, they were relatively small in number. About 68, 69 of them that went into Egypt. They went there seeking help. Help because there was a great famine and they had nothing to eat. They went to Egypt looking for food because Egypt had plenty. As it happens, God had provided for Egypt through unfortunate circumstances, which he turned around for good. You remember the story of Joseph. How Joseph had been sold into slavery. How he'd been taken off to Egypt, considered gone, dead, never to be seen again. And lo and behold, when the famine comes and his brothers turn up in Egypt looking for food, there he is standing right before them, one of the top men in the land. And through that, God's people were able to find security in a land that had plenty. And indeed, they were welcomed at first. But then, of course, things turned a little bit sour. A new Pharaoh comes along. He knows nothing about Joseph. All he knows is that in the province of Goshen, there's this big group of Hebrews, and they're getting bigger, and he's fearing them. They're getting powerful. I wonder how many times that's been said, maybe in this country. A particular people group, we're being overrun with them. They're getting powerful. Something needs to be done to control them, people say. Well, that's what they did with God's people. So measures were taken. We'll make them slaves. They can build our cities for us. They can make bricks. They can do all the hard labour, and we'll enjoy the product of their work. They put slave masters over them. They treated them harshly. And the more harshly they treated them actually, the more they prospered. And God continued to bless them. And they grew, and they grew, and they grew. They grew so much that after 400 years of living in Egypt, they eventually came out. Eventually. Hundreds of thousands of them left Egypt. That's how much they've been blessed. And this is where the psalmist picks it up. Because finally their slavery was over, 400 years of it. When Israel came out of Egypt, the house of Jacob, from a people of foreign tongue. Let's stop there. Israel and Jacob is the same. It's just different words for expressing the same thing. It's the thing with Hebrew poetry. Very often the second line kind of parallels the first line. And so you're reading the same thing but just in different words. They came out of Egypt, a land of foreign tongue. Indeed, they were a foreign tongue. You may remember that when Joseph's brothers came and stood before Joseph, and they began to talk to one another in their own language, thinking that Joseph couldn't understand them, and of course he understood every word. He, of course, had learnt a new language, but they were living among a people of foreign language. Now, I don't know about you, but when it comes to languages, I think I have a bit of a phobia. Not a nasty phobia. It's just that if somebody suggests to me, for example, why don't we go abroad somewhere? My first question is, do they speak English? Now, that's because, like so many other British people, I can't speak another language. And I find languages really difficult. Having done goodness knows how many years at School of French, and I can still only say bonjour and a few things, Very, very simple. We're afraid, aren't we, if we can't communicate. Communication is so important. And I can imagine that with all these Hebrews living together in this province, this land of Goshen, they didn't really need to learn the Egyptian language. So they carried on in their own tongue. And they were unable to mix. And let me just say, for those of you here who speak English only as a second language, I admire you for learning another language. So much easier that it must be to speak in your own language. So much easier it must be if you had, for example, a community of your own people around you, just to slip into that community. That would be simple. Much easier to Go into your own people, speak your own language with your own culture. But actually, for many people who are living in London today, that's not really an option. Because it's such a mix-up of people from all over the world that actually you might find there's a few people from where you come from who speak your language dotted among you in the community, amongst hundreds and thousands of others who don't. So we're forced to look for something common to use, a language that we can all speak. And that must be really hard for some people. And it's not just language, is it? It's culture too. You see, language is only part of it. Culture is something very different. I mean, sometimes even people who speak the same language have different cultures. And so, therefore, it can still be a little bit difficult to slip in to a new culture even with the same language. It's hard work. And so I admire those of you who have tried hard to say, but I want to fit in to my new home amongst the people that are there. And can I just say, for those of us that were born here and consider ourselves to be British natives, some of us perhaps could go back a long way and say, you know, we could trace our heritage back in these isles many, many generations. It's through and through in our blood. And yet we also have to realise that it's important for us to be welcoming to those who've come from other places too. Therefore, I think the proverbial "when in Rome, do as the Romans do" kind of attitude is not really an option for us. I mean, we hope, of course, that people who come in and live among us would like to learn something of what we do here in Britain. But I think it's much more than that. I think it's also a give and take situation. We also have to learn a little bit about the cultures that are coming among us. Actually, our culture doesn't stand still. Our culture has moved on too. We don't do things in exactly the same way as perhaps our parents did or our grandparents. And we've moved on an awful long way since, say, the Victorian era, or maybe a previous Georgian era before that, or back to the Middle Ages. We haven't stood still. We are moving all the time too. And so we need to be open to those that are around us. But Israel found itself in a foreign land. It was oppressed. And the thing that Israel wanted more than anything else was freedom again. Freedom came in the form of Moses. Moses was appointed by God to lead these people out. And it's remarkable what happens. The poetic language that describes the leaving of Israel out of Egypt. The sea looked and fled. In fact, even before that, verse 2, Judah became God's sanctuary, Israel his dominion. We'll talk a bit about what that means in just a moment. The sea looked and fled. The Jordan turned back. The mountains skipped like rams, the hills like lambs. There's this great celebration as well as a fear when God's people were brought out of slavery and into freedom. Let's break that down for a moment. Judah became God's sanctuary. Shouldn't that be the other way round? God became Judah's sanctuary? Shouldn't it be like that? But actually what he's saying here is indeed right. When they came out, God said to them, I'm now going to be your God. I'm going to be the one who leads you. And in the middle of my people, I want a place to live. Hence, God gives instructions for the construction of the tabernacle. A tent of meeting, a place where God would live, Later that became the temple. And so God was there among them. And when God was there among his people, the power of God was seen in such dramatic ways. In fact, as they brought out of Egypt, God went before them in a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud. The Red Sea did indeed flee. It parted, let them through. Later on, when they entered into Israel, the land of Canaan, as it was then, they take with them the Ark of the Covenant. And what happens as there is the presence of God with them, the Jordan parts and lets them through. As they enter into the land, what do they discover? That it's fruitful. That actually everything they turn to is like alchemy. Everything they touch seems to turn to gold. That actually they were prosperous. That they found so much abundance in the new land that they eventually ended up in. That it was just like the mountains skipped like rams, the hills like lambs. It was just such a fruitful place that God brought them to. A long journey to get there, it has to be said. It didn't happen overnight. It was another 40 years of wandering round and round a desert before they got there. Hard times. But then you see, as the psalmist brings the psalm to a close, he exhorts the nations around to pay attention. He says, if you've seen God at work in his people, this is what you need to remember. Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, who turned the rock into a pool, the hard rock into springs of water. Alluding, of course, to the time in the desert. There they were, nothing to drink. Moses speaks to the rock. He holds out his staff. One version tells us he struck it. The rock split open. Water gushed out. And there in the desert, pools of water. The people began to drink. Even in the desert, the place where they were bound to die. There's no food, God supplied it. There's no water, God refreshed them. God brought them through, not just for a day or two. 3 days or a week maybe, great numbers that it would have taken to have crossed that desert. No. 40 years God sustained them, even through the harshest of environments. And he brought them through into a land that was lush and green and fruitful. I'm not going to be tempted to go on too far, but just to mention that, of course, that's not the only time that God's people have known hardship and God bringing them out. There are other times too, and each time when they're taken captive, that actually there's a different method that's used. Many years later, we'll find the Assyrians come along and they cart off part of the kingdom, the northern half. It's an unequal half, by the way. But they cart them off, never to be returned again. 150 years after that, the Babylonians come along and they cart off the remaining part of the kingdom and take them into captivity. And we're going to look at Psalm 137 next week and look at that particular captivity. But what we find is that whenever God's people are taken out of their land, brought into captivity, when the shackles are put upon them, there is great grief in their hearts. But there is tremendous rejoicing when they're set free. Now, of course, today we can look at that and we can see some great parallels and pictures. I suppose you could say we're spiritualizing it a little bit. But I think that's legitimate. Because actually, what we find today is that the people of this world have still been put in chains. But the chains that they're put in, the slavery that they find themselves in, is that they're slaves to a sinful nature. That is why we find that we have people all over the world who are having to flee their countries. It's not just Syria. It's people from many other parts of the world too are having to run away from their countries because of the awful things that are happening. And sometimes these things last for a long time and sometimes just for a short time. But there are people who've had to escape. Why? Because of man's inhumanity to man. Why? Because of sin. And what we find is that Jesus came to break the chains, to break the power of sin, the captivity of sin that it has over our lives, and to set us free. And therefore, Galatians tells us that it is for freedom that we've been set free. No longer to be yoked to slavery again. Freedom. That's what Christianity is all about. We've been set free. And so as Christian people, we should know the joy and the delight of actually being set free once again. But actually at the same time, we're almost, we could say, still in that period of wandering around the desert. Yes, we've escaped from Egypt, and very often Egypt is used as the analogy of sin. It was the place of bondage, where they needed to be set free from that bondage. And then they started the journey, 40 years, a whole generation, a whole lifetime really, adult lifetime that is, of going from one place to another, walking in the desert, and as they went through the desert, so God provided for them. And in a similar way, we as Christians are still in that desert period. We're walking around a wilderness, and yet God provides for us. What is it that keeps us going? What is the motivation that says, let's go on? Now you remember that God's people, when they're walking around the wilderness, often grumbled and complained to Moses and said, do you know what? We're fed up of manna and quail. We want to go back to Egypt. We want to go back to our past life. Maybe it wasn't so bad as all of that. And sadly, there are some people today who start the Christian life and then they look and say, do you know what? I'd rather go back to the person I was before. That's a tragedy. And that means when we're looking back to Egypt, that we're not looking forward to the promised land. But God has promised that there is somewhere waiting for us. And so we continue, God supplying everything that we need for the journey as we head deeper and deeper towards his kingdom. And that is the ultimate thing that we're looking for, that this life is short. This life is not going to last that long. Even if we live to be 100 years of age, that's nothing compared to eternity. So let's keep our eyes fixed firmly on what is to come whilst enjoying the present, enjoying the blessing that God gives to us, providing everything that we need and so much more. Enjoying the fact that he is here with us, just as he was with his people Israel. That they could go to the tabernacle and they could worship him there. And in the same way that we can come and we can meet with him, not so much in a church building, although that's important, but because God puts his Spirit within us. His Spirit who teaches us and leads us and guides us, empowers us. That's what we have within us. The Spirit who brings joy into our hearts. The Spirit who enables us to, therefore, to have compassion on those who are going through struggles of their own. And so I encourage us to have hearts of compassion as we look at those who in this life have greater struggles than our own. To remember that we ourselves are strangers in a foreign land as Christian people. That's why we're finding all sorts of opposition to us, increasing opposition, even in the UK. Let me just share a concerning article that appeared in the Telegraph just recently. A leaked paper from the government. I haven't heard too much more about it. I need to check out a little bit more to find out what's been said, but I did pick up on this article. A leaked article that the Telegraph got hold of, saying that the government was planning that every religious leader in the UK would need to be trained and government registered. Trained according to their government rules. And anyone refusing to do so would not be allowed to have any access into public sector. i.e., for example, if I refused to go onto the register, that I would not be allowed to do a school assembly. I would not be allowed to do hospital visiting. Things like that. That's what we're up against. Now, they're putting it under terrorism laws, of course, and saying, therefore, if we treat one group, we've got to treat everybody the same. But it is concerning that there are talks apparently taking place, plans that are being made behind closed doors to try and control what God's church is doing in this country, amongst other groups too. We are strangers in a foreign land. We do not have absolute freedom. We do not belong in this world. We're just passing through. But all the time we're here, that we must remember that in a spiritual sense, that we live in a secular world. Yes. That we have to make our home here temporarily. Yes. We have to live amongst the people that are all around us. Yes. We have to take a full part, as much as we can, in society. Yes. But we're looking forward to going home. Let's keep our eyes fixed on what is yet to come, something that is better and glorious and eternal. Let's pray.